Hi, everybody. My name is Carla Weinhold. I'm going to be leading tonight's webinar, which is applying the C3 digitally, making the framework available for all students. Kind of what does that look like to you as the teacher? Where do I get sources? A lot of this can be a little overwhelming for our students and our teachers. I am currently a 7th grade ancient history teacher in Harford County, Maryland, which is about 25 miles north of Baltimore, Maryland. I've been teaching in the classroom for 22 years. 13 of those years have been teaching middle school social studies. The early part of my career, I spent teaching elementary, and one of my struggles as an elementary teacher was trying to fit everything in. I always seemed to have more hours of instruction than the students were physically in my classroom. So I always tried to balance of allowing my students to learn the social studies content in that limited time. And I wish I would have known about the inquiry model when I was an elementary teacher, because it's a natural way to take the students' curiosity about life and integrate content and then help them prepare for their life as a global citizen. As a middle school teacher, I find that using this inquiry model of a C3 framework is a natural lesson style. It naturally allows my kids to connect the content that I'm teaching with what they're interested in, with the world, what's happening in the world, and then to see where things have, transcended time. As a teacher, unfortunately, I have to accept the fact that every student that enters my room is not going to enter or leave a lover of history. But my goal isn't just to make them a lover of history, even though that's a benefit, is I want them to be able to be critical thinkers. I want them to be able to question their learning and question their thinking and question the experiences. And the C3 framework helps my students develop those skills so they can be successful adults. My goal for you tonight is to help you to better develop an understanding of the C3 framework and then show you how Active Classroom can support this instructional process for your students. If there are any questions that come up, please use the chat feature and Jessica can chime in and we can address the questions as we go. So using the C3 framework can give our students the ability to take ownership of the learning, help guide it in a structured way. As teachers, we want our students to be engaged in every lesson. We want them to see what we're teaching, even in ancient history, how it connects to the world that they live in or their lives moving forward as they move into adulthood. So this is a template that I use when I'm planning. I share it with my intern or interns when they come. But for a lot of teachers, knowing where to start a lot of times is the issue. Everybody has their own planning styles. Some of us write out formal lesson plans. Some of us just write notes in the PowerPoint. Whatever your style is, when you start working with the C3 framework, it can kind of be overwhelming. So this template kind of helps to break it down, and I can think about my lessons and my skills and my unit. So I like to start off with my essential question. What is it that I want my students to take away in this unit or in this portion of the unit? And then taking that learning objective and making it kind of, I can take that into the question. But thinking of the essential question as applying maybe to that bigger unit goal, not just that day's objective. Observable learning objectives are things that can easily be measured by the teacher using formative assessments or discussions or observations, anything that the teacher can use to get feedback on what the students are completing. But essential questions have lots of different characteristics. They are going to promote inquiry to big ideas. They cover the main content of the concepts that you'll be teaching. They require students to be able to transfer their learning. They make connections with prior learning and other experiences and make students be able to be thinking bigger beyond just the lesson for the particular day. They help students be able to consider evidence, be able to justify ideas, consider alternatives, be able to consider different perspectives, and they help make powerful and meaningful connections. So the next thing I like to do is when you're thinking of the question is think of the different kinds of questions, especially the kinds of questions that students can ask. Are we asking our students to question just to hook them? So a lot of our Dimension 1 is having our students kind of hooking them into that lesson or that unit of study, getting them to think, getting them to interest them about the new topic, spark curiosity, possibly even spark debate. If we're hooking using a hook question, it's only asked a few times. So there's some sample questions that help you understand the questions that hook. But if we move to questions that lead, these are asked with the point to be able to be answered. They have a correct answer, not a lot of debate. It's usually recall and information finding. It's asked until an answer or the correct answer is given, but it doesn't require a lot of support from teachers. Then we look at questions that guide, which also kind of helps along with the C3 framework. These are questions asked to encourage and guide the student's discovery of a topic. Can help point them towards a specific desired knowledge, but not necessarily towards a particular single answer. Can be asked over time throughout the unit, generally require students to do some explanation and support. But then we look at the essential questions, and these are asking our students to stimulate their ongoing thinking and inquiry. It should be raising more questions and wonderings that our students have or spark discussion and debate. It should be something that when you ask it at the beginning of the unit, should be re-asked and revisited throughout the unit, possibly the year. When we're asking essential questions, it should demand that our students justify and support their position and know that the answers can change as their knowledge and understanding changes. So another part of the lesson plan that we come to next is this idea of how am I going to assess my students' learning? So if we look at the difference between assessment for learning and assessment of learning, this is a constant debate in a lot of our schools of how are we assessing our students. Obviously, teachers should be assessing their students daily. I do not support that every day should be paper and pencil assessments, but more as asking ourselves, did the students master the objective? How am I knowing that my students met with success? How am I going to reteach? How am I going to enrich? So if we look at the chart on the right side of the screen, that should help you understand kind of the assessment of learning during the process, kind of checking their status along your teaching of that skill or activities, and then going into the for learning, sorry, let me switch that. Of learning, did they get it? It's that final end, did they learning? And then for learning, assisting your instruction along the way. So one way, the next piece of the lesson plan that I like to visit is kind of that warm-up hook, that Dimension 1. One strategy I like to use is a KWL chart, or I like the GNU.NEW.Q chart. So this is my GNU.NEW.Q chart that I use. For example, if I'm using this to kick off Rome, what do I know about Rome? I'm going to have my students do that in the beginning. It gives me a kind of a baseline. I can see if they have any misconceptions that I need to address or reteach. Then as we're going through the unit, it can be something that I do as a daily closure, maybe as an end of the week kind of thing. What new information are they learning throughout our unit on Rome, for example? And then I can have them record their questions. What questions do they have? It could be about maybe just the fall of the Roman Empire versus or fall of the Roman Republic, or specifically maybe about Julius Caesar, but it allows me to be able to kind of see where they're going, what they're wondering. And my kids come up with really good questions about what we're studying and what they want to learn more about. So another activity that I like to do is an image analysis. This is a great hook for Dimension 1, is to put a question or picture up for our students. And I like to start out with having my students just start talking about what they see in the image. I tell them not to infer, not to assume, just look at the image and tell me what they see. This is one that I use at the start of Rome, and then I make it come back also when we start talking about Julius Caesar. So my students, this for a lot of my students can take 15 or 20 minutes, where my students will see what they see in the picture and they start talking about it and they find the smallest details that people don't necessarily see. And then once we've kind of exhausted what we see in the image, then we start talking about what do we wonder? For example, in the picture, why my students often say, why is the one guy sitting off by himself? Is this a courtroom? And they start to come up with these really good questions that we can then incorporate into our inquiry and our discovery that we're going to continue to talk about. So another thing that I like to do is use videos or music clips. There is a video, let me see if it's gonna work. Should take you. So I like to use Mr. Nicky.
I'm a picture as a Virgo, I'm gonna right on the lake.
I have to go through the,
love having their own dock.
Sorry.
Romulus,
So I'm just gonna click through.
To build arch bridges, we got that's where you read and talk business. Build a Coliseum, fill the Coliseum. Get some gladiators, let the lions eat them. You know, the Roman Empire's growing, got to keep the conquer people.
So using Mr. Nicky, I like to use those musical clips because it gets my kids wondering, like, did they really fill the Coliseum? Did they really put water? How did they put water in there? So it gives them some great ideas and they come up with some great questions of themselves. Another activity that you can use as your Dimension 1 hook in your lesson is a brainstorm race. Give each kid or each group and break them up into teams, make it a competition. Brainstorm as many things as they can. You can give every kid a marker and make it like a silent activity. Everybody just has to write down. Then have the kids change groups and they can kind of elaborate on each other's ideas. Another way to engage students is the feely bag or box. Pull some items, almost like a museum exhibit, and have the students think about what do each of those items have to do with Rome. This is something I do at the beginning of the year with my students, and I put artifacts and pictures of artifacts because a lot of our artifacts are in museums. And I have my students start predicting what does each of these items have to do with what we're going to study. And they only know we're studying ancient world history. Another thing to do is do a museum walk. Have posters and data and maps, infographics, props, anything that we might want our students to absorb, and have them walk around the room. Have them have a graphic organizer out. What does this have to do with this particular topic? Have them make predictions, have them talk about it. The whole point of this Dimension 1 is to get our students engaged in thinking about what we're going to study. So if we go on to Dimension 2 and we think still about that lesson plan, what disciplinary knowledge are we going to ask our students to use? Are we focusing just on history? Are we talking history and civics? Are we blending 2 or 3 of the skill sets together? Are we looking at history and civics and geography and economics? Are we looking them in isolation? So a lot of times trying to find resources as a teacher is one of the struggles. And then a lot of teachers say that they can't do C3 inquiry lessons because they have struggling readers and they'll never be able to be successful and they don't want to set their students up for failure. Then we have other teachers who say, I have a pacing schedule, there's not enough instructional time to teach using the C3 framework. So there are a lot of resources, even within Active Classroom. Even if you don't do the full C3 lesson, and I'll show you where those are shortly later in the presentation, but looking at some of the skills and activities and doing them kind of in pieces to support instruction. The National Council for the Social Studies has excellent resources on their website for C3. The c3teachers.org has resources. There's blogs and activities. And then there are a lot of instructional strategies like the KWL chart are things that we've been using as teachers for decades, and how you present it and use it might actually fit the purpose of the different dimensions. So one way you can support your struggling readers is use graphic organizers, helping the students guide their thinking, record their thinking. Another way you can do it is you can take the original text that might be above your student's reading level, but then next to it have a simplified version. So they still get to see both. Another feature that I like that's built in with Active Classroom is the Read To feature. So a lot of my struggling readers, when I'm doing Active Classroom activities, they're using the reading feature that can help them not have to focus on decoding, but they can get the content that I need them to get out as well. So this is a box that I use with my students to allow them to be able to organize their resources and work together in groups. I'm very big on file folders and color coordinating everything. Everything kind of has a place, so it helps my students kind of see and set up for success. Another feature that Active Classroom has, and there's numerous of these around the internet, is how to analyze a primary source. So taking time out of our instruction, especially early in the school year, teaching students, how do I question a source? How do I consider the source's origins? This is something I spent extensive time at the beginning of the year. We just started doing a DBQ analysis looking at the fall of Rome with my students today. And the first thing they do is they look at the source and they start talking about what the source might have to do with giving the information and what biases they have to look at. So my students are very good at looking at information and being able to think critically, which is that third part of D3, being able to evaluate the information. This is a skill that our students need well beyond our classroom. For a lot of students, this is done kind of at the same time as they're doing their D2 content work. They're analyzing the source, they're looking at the purpose, the relevance, the bias, how old is the document, is there anything new? So I see dimensions 2 and 3 kind of happening simultaneously once your students get into being able to develop these skills. So this is a framework that's been out so you can kind of see how the 4 stages of C3 kind of go along with what NCSS says is the standards for expectation. So if we're looking, developing questions and planning investigation, our students are already questioning. So it's adding on that compelling and supporting questions that are out there. Applying in Dimension 2, applying disciplinary tools and concepts, taking what our students need to know, what's the actual content skills that our students need to know, and then being able to, in Dimension 3, gather and evaluate and use evidence, figure out what processes and skills our students need to be able to do to be able to evaluate that evidence. And then that 4th dimension is being able to give our students the opportunity to communicate what they've learned, and then be able to go beyond and take that informed action and see their role in the classroom. Another strategy is using this CARRDS strategy, teaching our students how to analyze sources. This is something that could be an anchor chart. It is something that I think our students need to be directly taught. This is something that's going to help them as they move through life and being able to look at sources, look at news, the whole fake news that's going on. So all of this information is going to help them be successful in life beyond just our classroom instruction. This is a graphic organizer that I use with my students. I obviously modify it depending on the content or the topic that they're doing, but I have my students identify the source. Sometimes it might be source A if they're doing a DBQ. I always have them summarize the source and then have them make the connection of, so what does this source tell me about the topic? For example, today they were starting to study the fall of ancient Rome. So they looked at a data table. And then I had them summarize that the data table showed all of the emperors that ruled in Rome from 235 to 285. And then what does this tell us is the source told them that there were 22 emperors in the 50-year period and 14 of them were assassinated. So that gives them a perspective that it was a turbulent time in Rome's history where there was a large turnover. So it gives them kind of that grounded purpose when they're analyzing and thinking about the sources. I also spend time teaching my students how to annotate text. When I taught elementary school, I used to call it sticky note reading. I would have an anchor chart with all the different symbols, a question mark where they would question, a smiley face if they loved something, or a heart, or an angry face. We did a lot of emojis before they were emojis, I guess. They would make connections. I just had an arrow back and forth for connections, but it stopped my students from just glossing over the text, but really reading and thinking about the text, which is what I want them to do during that dimension 2 and 3. I really want my students to connect and apply what they're reading, not just reading the words. I wanted to lead, when we're leading into dimension 4, is think about this quote that a lot of us have seen if we've been in education for a while. I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. By giving our students the opportunity to apply their learning, take that content information and put it into a new situation, this is where a lot of our learning can take place for our students. Whether that is a project, whether I'm asking them to write a letter to a senator trying to learn and understand the connection of the Senate in ancient Rome versus the Senate in modern day. So being able to communicate and connect that knowledge. So a lot of teachers want to know, I don't have time to plan all these lessons. How do I get to lessons that are there and being able to kind of pick and choose, maybe not use all the sources? Active Classroom has great resources. So if you start out going to your search and you put your topic, American history, modern world history, whatever you want, whatever your focus is, if it's Rome, and then you go to your advanced feature, you choose the series title from the advanced pull-down menu that comes, and then you look for the C3 inquiry. So this is one I just happened to pull, C3 in world history. What does the mandate of heaven have to do with China's past? I've used several times, what do Gothic cathedrals tell us about medieval Europe, when I'm talking about the development of the Catholic Church and the impact of the church on daily life in the Middle Ages. You can take pieces of this as kind of an introduction. You can take and just do the middle pieces. So typically, if I'm planning a full C3 lesson, I'm looking at 2 or 3 days. But if you take and think about the C3 process across your unit, if you do an engagement hook activity for your Dimension 1 to hook students into the unit, you can build your content lessons around history and civics and economics and geography, all of the things that we do throughout a unit in history anyway, and then build in that assessment day, and beyond just paper and pencil, what can I do to assess my students' learning. You're doing many assessments along the way, but that big assessment piece that you're doing as well. So I want to leave you with a final thought when you're thinking about our students. Gone are the days where we would hand out packets and worksheets, we hope, to our students day in and day out. We want to get our students involved in the learning process. We want them to question and wonder. We don't want them to just sit and be passive observers of instruction. We want them to be engaged in the instruction. We want them to learn to communicate with each other, agree to disagree, have these powerful discussions and debates. We want to teach them that learning is a powerful tool and they can control that. So the quote that I want to leave you with is, I would rather have one day of authentic student engagement than a career of handing out worksheets. So hopefully you have a better idea and understanding of how you might be able to incorporate the C3 framework into your planning, how to help improve maybe student learning, where to find resources, how Active Classroom has resources available. So to bring us to a close, using the chat feature, I want you to think about how you're thinking about C3 and instruction has changed. How have I confirmed your thinking? And then what can you take back, hopefully, and use something with your students tomorrow?
Thank you, Carla. You've given us a lot to think about. Carolyn does have a question. She says, do you have students write questions after listening to the song, or you just ask the questions orally?
Carolyn, I've done it both ways, where I've had my students kind of keep a log of questions. I've had students where I'll show the video and then I'll have them turn and talk, almost like a think, pair, share, about what they saw in the video and what they think it might mean. And then sometimes I've come back with that same video when I'm doing my review day and have them revisit some of those questions. Now, can you answer some of those questions from the beginning?
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions that I can answer?
I'm go ahead and